Thunder rumbled from the horizon and lightning bursts illuminated the pitch-black sky. Sophie tightened her thin coat around her body as she alighted from the creaky bus, her boots plunging into the soggy, mud-soaked ground. A fragrance that painfully tugged at her memories was the familiar aroma of damp grass and cold wind that permeated the air. However, this sentiment of nostalgia was not sustained for an extended period. She was left with an unsettling sensation as an invisible shiver crept up her spine. There was an issue. It was not the environment that affected her. Rather, it was an internal factor. Or even worse, something about this location. The wooden farmhouse was situated in the middle of the fields, its porch light emitting a faint yellow glow that scarcely penetrated the darkness. Caleb was already present, his hands buried in his pockets as he nonchalantly leaned against the porch post. He refrained from smiling. Rather, his gaze was fixed on Sophie, both calm and intense, as if he had been anticipating her arrival for an extended period. She was unsettled by the manner in which he stood and the way the breeze played with his loose shirt. Caleb addressed Aunt Sophie with a low, gravelly voice that resonated like the wind that swept across the fields. "You are present." Sophie walked slowly toward him, nodding. "Indeed, I am present." Despite her efforts to maintain a steady tone, she was unable to entirely conceal the disquiet that gnawed at her words. Caleb refrained from moving. He observed her intently, his eyes tracing every subtle movement and inhalation she took, as if he were attempting to decode her. Sophie observed an unusual occurrence as she entered the veranda. The threshold was followed by a red streak that vanished into the dim interior of the home. It was not sufficiently substantial to be alarming, but it was certainly enough to attract her attention. Blood? Paint? She was uncertain. "What is this?" she inquired while pointing to the streak. Caleb maintained his expression as he peered downward. He nonchalantly replied, "A wounded coyote wandered in last night." However, there was something in his demeanor that caused Sophie's skin to tingle. "I intended to tidy it up. It was unexpected for you to arrive so early." Sophie's anxiety was not significantly alleviated by his response. The red stain vanished into the shadows of the home as she once again examined it. As she entered, her chest contracted with an unexplainable weight. The living room lamp's dim golden light was insufficient to dispel the eerie cold that seemed to adhere to the area. An open book, its pages torn and crumpled, rested on the table, and a chair near the fireplace was toppled. The curtains delicately swayed as a gentle breeze entered through the partially open window. "Do you recall the estate in this manner?" Caleb's voice emanated from behind her, simultaneously placid and inquisitive as if to gauge her response. Sophie turned to face him, and her gaze met his eyes, which were unlike any she had ever seen in him. They were not the eyes of the boy she had previously known. They were sharp, piercing, and infused with a sensation that caused her to feel apprehensive. Sophie responded, "You have undergone a transformation," in an attempt to divert his attention and alleviate her own disquieting emotions. However, she could not resist the realization that this return was not at all what she had been anticipating. Caleb's gaze, which was unwavering and inquisitive, appeared to convey an implicit message, a secret that she was not expecting to learn. Caleb murmured, his voice scarcely audible, "Everything has changed." Sophie was left perplexed as to whether her disquiet was truly about him or about herself, as his words lingered in the air, laden with implication. In any case, she was aware that this reunion would be far from the tranquil respite she had anticipated. Sophie stood in the compact kitchen, where the aged hanging lamp's diffuse illumination cast delicate shadows on the weathered wooden walls. The morning's faint bread scent persisted in the air, evoking memories of an existence that had long since passed. She extended her hand, allowing her fingertips to lightly touch the smooth wooden counter, which was the exact location where her grandmother would knead the dough for the family's meals. Every scratch and crack in the wood seemed to whisper stories from the past, reminding her of the simple, joyful days she had left behind. Sophie had run barefoot across the endless fields as a child, her laughter echoing alongside her grandmother's warm chuckles from the veranda. Days filled with unbounded freedom and no thought of tomorrow were the most magical times of her life during the summers at the farm. However, as she matured, she was enveloped in the tumult and expectations of urban life. In the belief that she had discovered a new family and a new beginning, she married, only to discover years later that she had lost herself in the midst of responsibilities and a love that had devolved into routine. The memories tore at her chest, causing her to gasp for air. Sophie attempted to flee the images that were resurfacing in her mind by turning away. However, Caleb entered the kitchen, his presence betraying a calm yet substantial weight. He placed a bucket of water on the floor, and the droplets of water that splashed left small marks on the wooden boards. "Are you still able to recall this location?" he inquired, his voice composed yet inquisitive, his eyes fixated on her with a gaze that appeared to analyze each thought she had. "Certainly," Sophie responded, her voice barely audible above a whisper, virtually drowned out by the faint sound of the wind rustling outside. "This location was once of paramount importance to me." She endeavored to maintain a neutral, even tone. However, Caleb appeared to discern an underlying, unspoken meaning in her words. Although he nodded slightly, he did not provide any further commentary. This was always the case with Caleb. He was silent, deliberate, and each word he spoke was weighed with significance. Sophie's mind wandered to the last time she had visited this location, which was during the summer of her 20th year. At that time, the farm was a sanctuary, a place that was overflowing with hope and renewal. However, the current situation was distinct. The house was no longer a sanctuary for healing, it was now a repository of secrets, including those of the house and its inhabitants, as well as her own. Caleb endeavored to clear the water from the floor, but his eyes occasionally drifted to her, a deliberate yet fleeting act. Her unease was exacerbated by the calm intensity of that expression. "What is the duration of your stay?" Sophie abruptly inquired, forcing the query to escape her lips in an effort to break the oppressive silence. Caleb responded without glancing up, stating that it had been 10 years. "However, I assume you are unaware of this, correct?" While his tone was not accusatory, it was also not gentle. It was direct and unpretentious. Sophie felt a sudden surge of remorse. This was accurate. She had never inquired about Caleb in any significant way. In the fragmented conversations she had with her aunt, he had consistently been a peripheral figure. Sophie acknowledged, "You have undergone a significant transformation," as she cautiously examined Caleb. "I recall you as a timid child who consistently concealed himself behind your mother." Caleb's laughter was brief and mirthless. "It is impossible for individuals to remain children indefinitely, is it?" His gaze abruptly became more acute and penetrating as he straightened up. "And neither can you. Sophie, you have also undergone a transformation. Not solely on the exterior. Additionally, there is an interior." Sophie was struck by the words with the force of a blade. They were more precise than any information she had previously encountered. However, how was it possible for him to perceive her in such a manner? How could Caleb, whom she knew only superficially, comprehend her internal conflicts? Sophie declined to respond. She stood there, feeling like she was shorn bare by the weight of his gaze, unable to conceal herself. Caleb continued to maintain his gaze upon her as he retreated. He said, his voice subdued and resonant with an unspoken emotion, "You believe that this farm remains the same, but it is not. You may not be aware of the extent to which it has evolved." Sophie felt a chill down her spine, and it was not due to the airflow that was making its way through the window. The subdued warning that Caleb's words contained was the weight of the matter. His statement contained an additional element, a concealed meaning that was awaiting discovery. Sophie was uncertain about whether or not she was prepared to reveal it. However, a single thing was certain to her in her heart. The tranquil retreat she had envisioned would be far from reality upon her return to the farm. The frigid atmosphere that persisted between Sophie and Caleb was not sufficiently alleviated by the pale sunlight that filtered through the kitchen window that morning. They had become acclimated to this peculiar silence, a tense silence that neither of them desired to disturb. Sophie was preoccupied with preparing breakfast, her hands occupied with a sizzling pan. However, her mind was awash in restless loops, plagued by the unspoken weight of Caleb's gaze from behind her. "Is there anything you require? Please allow me to assist you." The silence was interrupted by Caleb's deep, steady voice, which caused Sophie to jump as if she were captured in the act of committing an illegal act. She swiveled to meet his gaze, which was keen, penetrating, and imbued with an indescribable quality. Sophie attempted to maintain her composure by shaking her head, but her fingertips trembled as she placed the pan down. She replied gently, "No, I have it." Caleb refrained from making any further inquiries. He proceeded to the sink, activated the faucet, and commenced hand cleansing. The straightforward action appeared peculiarly charged, as if it bore a burden that neither of them could articulate. Sophie could now sense the warmth emanating from him, and hear the constant rhythm of his breath as they drew nearer. Far too much. She took a step back, retreating as if his presence were a conflagration that she could not risk being burned by. On that afternoon, they collaborated in the fields to care for the tall vegetation that required cutting prior to the onset of winter. Sophie was resolute in her efforts to remain undistracted, donning an antiquated straw bonnet. However, she was unable to disregard the weight of Caleb's gaze that followed her from across the field, despite her best efforts. His movements were fluid and precise, and he worked with quiet efficiency. However, Sophie's gaze would meet his every time she looked up. Caleb maintained his gaze. He maintained her gaze, his expression unyielding as if he were taunting her to acknowledge the unspoken tension that festered between them. Sophie felt completely depleted by the late afternoon, as the sun descended low on the horizon, casting streaks of golden light across the fields. She sank into the shade of a large oak tree, wiping the perspiration from her brow. As Caleb approached, he held a bottle of water in his hand. He observed that she appeared fatigued and placed the container beside her. Sophie accepted it with gratitude, taking a small drink while her gaze remained fixed on him. Caleb sat in close proximity to her, allowing her to observe the faint sheen of perspiration on his neck. "Have you ever entertained the possibility of permanently residing here?" Caleb abruptly inquired, his voice gentle yet resonant with significance. Sophie was taken aback by the inquiry and glanced at him. She acknowledged that she had not. "I simply required a pause." Caleb bowed, but his gaze never strayed from hers. "This location," he said quietly, "it is not the same as you remember, and neither am I." Sophie was unable to disregard the profundity of his words, which possessed an edge. She did not respond, despite the fact that her heart rate increased. The only sound they heard was the gentle murmur of the wind through the grass as they sat in silence under the oak tree. A whirlwind of emotions that felt both familiar and alarming swirled in Sophie's chest, causing her thoughts to churn. She endeavored to convince herself that it was merely the exhaustion and the longing to return to the farm. However, Caleb's eyes, those eyes that appeared to penetrate every defense she had constructed, were the exception. They sat on the front veranda later that evening, beneath a sky that was strewn with stars that twinkled like a vast luminous tapestry. Sophie concentrated on the chilly night breeze and the soothing chirp of crickets while holding a warm cup of tea. However, the mere presence of Caleb beside her intensified each of her sensibilities, rendering her acutely aware of his proximity. Caleb abruptly interrupted the silence. "Aunt Sophie," he began, his voice subdued yet firm. "Do you ever experience? Are you feeling isolated?" Sophie was startled by the inquiry. She turned to gaze at him, her gaze falling upon his eyes, which had become darker and had lost their familiar tranquility. Sophie hesitated. She was aware that the question was more significant than the words themselves, and in that brief instant, she felt every barrier she had constructed between them crumble. "Indeed," she conceded gently, her voice steady yet unseasoned. "I have been feeling isolated for an extended period of time." For the first time, Sophie observed a quiet, agonizing vulnerability in Caleb's eyes that mirrored her own as his gaze softened. "I concur," he admitted, his voice scarcely rising above a whisper. "However, I no longer experience this sentiment as a result of your return." His words lingered in the air between them, delicate yet unyielding, like an invisible thread that drew Sophie closer to him. Caleb's gaze held hers firmly, grounding her in the moment, and she longed to say something, anything, to break the tension. Sophie immediately recognized that all walls between them had been dismantled, and every line between them had become indistinct. She no longer experienced fleeting moments of uncertainty. Rather, her emotions were unequivocal and irrefutable. They frightened her more than any other experience she had ever had. After that evening, the atmosphere within the home became more oppressive, as if Sophie and Caleb were aware of a change that had occurred, but they were unwilling to acknowledge it. Sophie persisted in convincing herself that everything would be resolved if she maintained her distance and disregarded the veiled words and gestures that Caleb directed her way. However, Caleb appeared as a shadow that she could not evade. Despite her resolve to avoid him, the wind howled across the fields, conveying the anticipation of a storm, as the sky hung low and gray that day. Sophie spent the morning cleaning the house in an effort to divert her attention and suppress the torrent of thoughts that were raging through her consciousness. Caleb was observed in the distance, walking toward the house with swift, deliberate steps, as she ascended the veranda to retrieve the laundry in the afternoon. He was holding something firmly in his hand and his shirt was smeared with mud. An inexplicable unease crept into Sophie's chest as she froze, her eyes fixated on him. "What is the situation?" she inquired as Caleb ascended the stairs to the porch, his visage tense with anxiety. Caleb did not respond immediately. Instead, he presented her with a crumpled piece of paper, his expression impossible to interpret. Her heart seemed to stop as she read the scrawled words as Sophie unfurled it. "They are aware." Although they were merely 2 words, they exerted an immense pressure on her, akin to a leaden sky. Sophie's eyes were ablaze with fear as she gazed up at Caleb. "What is the significance of this?" she inquired, her voice quivering. Caleb shook his head, but his gaze was illuminated by a fleeting flash of frigid determination. "I am uncertain, however it is evident that someone observed something." Sophie felt a shiver run down her spine. Eleanor, her astute acquaintance who had visited the farm mere days prior, resurfaced in her thoughts. Sophie was unable to escape the suspicion that she may have observed something in the manner in which Caleb looked at her, as Eleanor had always been perceptive, albeit in an unsettling manner. However, was Eleanor genuinely responsible for the note? Alternatively, was it another individual? Sophie was unaware of the writer's identity. However, it abruptly seemed irrelevant. Their secret was no longer secure, and that was the most pressing issue. Caleb's gaze penetrated her like a blade as he approached. "No matter who composed it, Aunt Sophie, I am aware of one thing. We are unable to continue to maintain the illusion that nothing has transpired." He spoke with a subdued intensity, his voice steady, as if he were anticipating Sophie's admission of the truth that they both already knew. Sophie naturally retreated, but Caleb refrained from permitting her to do so. His words were as unyielding as his presence as he stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Does it not resonate with you?" he persisted, his voice gentle yet insistent. "I am aware that we are deceiving ourselves each time I gaze upon you." "No, Caleb," Sophie whispered, "it is not like that," although her voice was devoid of conviction. Caleb's lips curved into a bitter smile. "You are capable of deceiving me. However, you are incapable of deceiving yourself." Sophie made a sudden change of direction, attempting to escape into the home. However, Caleb caught her wrist, causing a jolt that went through her body. His voice was urgent and almost imploring as he said, "You cannot continue to flee, Sophie. It is imperative that we discuss this matter. If we do not, the situation will only worsen." Sophie's irises were filled with conflict as she yanked her hand free. "Caleb, this is incorrect. We are a family. Do you not comprehend that? Who is your family? Caleb concurred, his voice tinged with exasperation and disbelief. You employ that term to rationalize everything, Sophie, but you are aware, as I am, that we are not related. We have never been. She was struck by his words like a blade, which penetrated every defense she had, leaving her vulnerable. He was correct. The bond between them was never comparable to that of a family, at least not in the manner that others had imagined. However, acknowledging that truth necessitated confronting the reality that she had worked tirelessly to evade, a reality that was too much to endure. The windows were rattling as if the tempest itself was attempting to tear the house apart as the wind howled louder outside. Sophie returned to Caleb, experiencing a sensation of her entire universe collapsing. Caleb, this is impossible. I am unable to. The weight of her emotions caused her voice to break, and she trembled. However, Caleb approached with an intensity that she had never witnessed before, his eyes ablaze with fervor. Caleb murmured, I don't require your input. His voice was low but adamant. I simply require your attention to your emotions. Sophie, we have neglected this matter for an excessive amount of time. However, the situation is now apparent and cannot be denied. I am unable to return. I am aware that you are also unable to do so. Sophie was left with no place to shelter as a result of his words, which stripped her bare. The storm raging outside was a perfect mirror of the chaos within her. As she stood frozen in the tiny, dimly illuminated room, Sophie came to the realization that Caleb's words were accurate at that precise instant. This was not solely about him. It was about her, about the desires and anxieties she had suppressed for an extended period of time. A decision had to be made, a decision that would alter the course of history indefinitely. The wooden home was enveloped in an eerie silence following their disagreement. Sophie felt as though the entire house trembled in its aftermath as Caleb stormed out, slamming the door with such force. She remained motionless in the living room, her gaze fixated on the door that had just closed behind him. The overwhelming weight in her thorax was the only thing that remained as the background faded. The wind howled through the cracks in the doorframe, signaling the impending arrival of a tempest. However, a tempest had been raging within Sophie for a much longer period. She approached the window at a leisurely pace, peering through the hazy glass. Caleb stood on the veranda, his hands firmly grasping the wooden railing, his gaze fixed on the vast darkness of the fields. Sophie could sense the internal tumult that was simmering within him, a reflection of her own, despite his resolute, rigid stance. She desired to exit the building in order to express a sentiment that would serve as a conduit between them. However, her legs were immobilized by the magnitude of the situation. She was aware that they had gone too far, but she also knew that there was no turning back. Every word spoken, every lingering glance, and every fleeting instant shared between them. They were all components of a conundrum that she was too apprehensive to solve. Sophie had persuaded herself that the entire situation was a misunderstanding or an illusion. However, the truth was now unmistakable and unavoidable. Sophie was startled by a sudden pounding at the door which shattered the oppressive silence. She abruptly turned, her heart pounding in response to Eleanor's voice on the other side. Sophie, are you currently at home? Sophie hastily opened the door, endeavoring to conceal the chaotic atmosphere within and regain her composure. Eleanor entered the room, her acute eyes assessing the surroundings. She briefly observed Sophie before hurriedly proceeding to the veranda, where Caleb was still present. She did not speak, however, the furrows on her temples conveyed a great deal. She was aware that something was amiss. The tone of Eleanor's voice was subdued but firm as she led Sophie into the kitchen, grasping her arm. For how long will you permit this situation to persist? You are aware that it is impossible to conceal it indefinitely. Sophie experienced the sensation of having a dagger inserted into her bosom. She attempted to maintain her composure, but her voice faltered. I am unaware of the subject matter, she replied. Eleanor fixated her with a piercing gaze, her eyes as cold and cutting as steel. Sophie, you are acutely aware of the subject matter. I observed the manner in which Caleb and you regard each other. Sophie received the words with the force of a strike. She desired to dispute it, to proclaim that Eleanor was mistaken. However, the reality was too burdensome for her to maintain any pretense. Sophie murmured, "I am at a loss as to what to do," as tears welled up in her eyes. "I am unable to remain in this location any longer. However, I am unable to depart without confronting this issue." Eleanor tightly grasped Sophie's hands as if she were wishing for her fortitude to be transferred to her. "Sophie, it is imperative that you reach a conclusion. Not only for yourself, but also for Caleb. It is impossible to maintain him in this state of uncertainty. It is unjust." Sophie lay awake that night, gazing at the dimly lit ceiling as the wind howled outside, its somber laments blending with the confusion in her mind. She repeatedly visualized Caleb on the porch, his eyes filled with a combination of hope and anguish that would not allow her to rest. She was aware of the necessity of her actions. However, the act of confronting the truth felt akin to removing a portion of her identity. Sophie stood by the front door with her old suitcase at her feet as the first rays of sunlight extended across the fields in the morning. Caleb's irises were bloodshot and hollow, as if he had not slept at all, and he was only a few steps away. "You are truly departing." His voice was husky, devoid of wrath, but reeking with sorrow. I did not intend to dispute her decision with this inquiry. Rather, it was an appeal for comprehension. However, each syllable seemed to be burdened by an unbearable burden. Sophie's fingertips were clasping the handle of her suitcase as she nodded. "Caleb, I am obligated to. I am not motivated to do so, rather, we are unable to continue in this manner. I, like you, must live my existence." Caleb approached with his gaze beseeching. "You lack comprehension. I require nothing else but you. It is feasible for us to." Sophie interrupted him by raising her hand. "No, Caleb. We are unable to. I am not doing so because I am uncaring toward you, rather it is because this will be detrimental to both of us. There are boundaries that should never be breached, and we have already approached them." She turned to depart, her steps laden with the weight of her words. However, Caleb's voice, which was low but resonant with genuine emotion, interrupted her as she approached the vehicle. "I will never forget you, Aunt Sophie." Sophie briefly paused, her breath catching, but she did not turn to glance back. She clambered into the car, leaving Caleb behind, and a single tear dropped down her cheek as the car rolled away from the farm. His figure faded into the distance. Sophie took one final look back and Caleb was still standing there, his gaze fixated on her as if he were attempting to permanently imprint her image in his memory. Sophie was aware that she had made the correct decision, despite the fact that the pain in her heart threatened to consume her. Because at times, love is not about maintaining a relationship, it is about relinquishing it. Sophie whispered a silent hope that both she and Caleb would find serenity, even if it meant being apart, as the field stretched out beneath the golden morning sun. The story's just beginning. There are more broken hearts and dark secrets ahead. Hit like, subscribe, and keep exploring with Love Missteps.